So let's talk about some hedonistic perfectionist space marines, flawless duelists, sonic weapons and demon Primarch Fulgrim, with an overview of the codex of the new faction to hit Warhammer 40k in Emperor's Children. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Emperor's Children, and in this video let's do an overview of the core rules from their codex, talking about their Thrill Seekers rule, all their new detachments and new datasheets. This one's definitely a pretty big one for Warhammer 40k. The Emperor's Children have long been part of Codex Chaos Space Marines, though it has been suspected for quite a long time that they should get a book all of their own, given that we've had that for the other deity legions, and now we have this term in all its Slaaneshi glory, and there is a fair bit of fun stuff here in my opinion. Starting out with the book itself, there'll be 3 different codex covers for it. This limited version on the left with some classic artwork, a new Noise Marine one as the sort of standard mainline release, and then Games Workshop are also making this extra ridiculously fancy one with the big case and things, plus a whole bunch of metal tokens. I'm sure that one will cost a pretty penny. The first place that Codex Emperor's Children is releasing will be the Emperor's Children launch box in Champions of Slaanesh. So as usual, there'll be a bit of a gap between this book coming out and that box set, and then a few weeks gap before the mainline release comes along with Fulgrim. If you were looking to pick up that box set, or the codex individually when it comes out, there's a bunch of discount retailers linked down in the video description that can save a bit versus Games Workshop, and anything bought through those does go to help support Auspex Tactics a little bit. Here are the pre-order times for those discount stores around the world for when the big Champions of Slaanesh box goes live, generally from Friday night to Saturday morning. As ever, a big thank you to any of you supporting the channel via those when you do pick up some 40k things. In any case though, let's get into the contents of the book, and as ever this one has all the things you'd expect in a 40k codex, lore and miniature galleries, telling about the Emperor's Children and the new range of models that they've brought out for them. All the Crusade content, including certain things like Boons of Slaanesh, and various flavourful combat elixirs, combat patrol rules for the ones with the new Lord Exultant, Infractors and Flawless Blades, and then of course the big mainstream rule section for the Codex, which will be the one that I'm focusing on today. The core rule for the army being Thrill Seekers, allowing them to move up the board really quickly and not be tied down in any one boring combat for too long. There's a small auxiliary rule in Pacts of Excess for some bookkeeping for Daemons, and then there's 6 different detachments, all with 4 enhancements, 6 stratagems and a core detachment rule. Some of them may be a bit more general purpose versus others. If anything, it was kind of surprising that the Emperor's Children got quite this many when certain big factions like say Tau only had 4 in their codex, unless Games Workshop were just deliberately trying to shoot for Slaanesh's holy number. Then finally we've got 22 datasheets, the new Noise Marines and Lucius the Eternal, the ones that we expected to get updated. Then 6 other unique units including Demon Primarch Fulgrim himself. 9 generic Chaos Space Marine units, perhaps a bit less than you would have guessed for these guys given the past precedent of the other deity legions, and then 5 more sort of allied demons, which are unfortunately locked to just the one detachment, so won't be appearing in most Emperor's Children armies. It does mean that the unit list is a bit on the thin side. There is also the points section in the book as well, though Games Workshop like to update things, and the points cost will be available via the Monitor and Field Manual digital download shortly after. Lots to talk about, so let's jump straight in. I will start with the army rule, which is Thrill Seekers, basically giving it a good dose of Slaaneshi speed and playing into the whole trope of the Emperor's Children being Thrill Seekers and hedonistic, making war at an absolute breakneck speed and peeling back and re-engaging at will. The detachment rule basically gives you advanced shoot and charge and fallback shoot and charge with a few restrictions, which both of those are absolutely great rules and just mean that you've got lots more flexibility in 40k. Advance and shoot means you'll be able to get more lines of sight more regularly, plus might not have to compromise between moving up to an objective and still opening fire. Advance and charge just gives you flatly better charge threat range, better choices of targets and being able to get the jump on the opponent rather than the other way around. Fallback and shoot means your shooting units can't really get locked up. You can't just tag a bunch of Noise Marines with a transport or something to stop them firing, they'll just be able to back away and fire at something else. And fallback and charge means that you can peel back from a unit, charge into something completely different, and again you can't get pinned down in an unfavourable combat that doesn't make sense. These aren't completely unrestricted though and have a couple of restrictions that mean that it's not quite 100% free, and you might need to put a bit more thought into the rule compared with if they didn't exist. When you're making use of this rule, you can't target a unit that was within engagement range at the start of the turn. So say if you had an Emperor's Children melee unit that fell back from a unit at the start of the turn, you couldn't just immediately charge into the same thing and deal damage to them, as you're not able to target them. You'd have to go after something else and hop from one combat to the next. And as well as that, you also can't target a unit that was the target of another unit's charge or attack this phase. So say for example, if you had a unit that advanced and wanted to advance and shoot, you wouldn't be able to shoot any of the units that had already been shot by another thing in your army. and he couldn't have two melee units advance and charge side by side. It means that it's a bit better for units working in isolation potentially, where those restrictions aren't really all that big deals, but you could run into at least some mobility problems if you want to focus everything down on one unit, as you'd have to either get units to slow down or really think about what's engaging what. Overall, it does feel like a really powerful rule though. In particular, advance and charge means that you should be able to hit the enemy before they hit you quite a lot of the times, and make some safe charges from behind terrain into the enemy. And just in general, a lot of extra movement is really handy in 40k, and immunity to being locked up isn't going to happen against every single army in a massively meaningful way, but when it does matter, sometimes it can be absolutely huge. While we're on core rules, it's probably worth talking about the allied Slaanesh demons. They also have a small core rule as well. As mentioned, there's 5 demon datasheets in the book: Shalaxi Hellbane, the Keeper of Secrets, Demonettes, Fiends and Seekers, and these can only be used in the one detachment, the Carnival of Excess one, and there's no option to ally them into the others. This doesn't appear to be any sort of replacement for the actual core Chaos Demons army, given that there's massive amounts of units missing. There's no Heralds, no Chariots, no Soul Grinders of Slaanesh, and no other named heroes like the Contorted Epitome. Games Workshop have said that they'll still be fully playable with their Grotmas detachment, at least within 10th edition. It does mean that compared with demon allies that they would have been able to take before, the list really is quite small though, and it means that you'd have to give up on using the vast amount of detachments in the Codex to actually field them in the first place, and that has been a disappointment to some people at least. For the way they function, these demon datasheets get the Legions of Excess keyword instead of the Emperor's Children one, and they have a core rule called Pacts of Excess, which basically prevents you from selecting Legions of Excess as the overall army keyword, so you can't field an army just of them. It has to be Emperor's Children, and then that specific detachment allows you to take those specific units. Even in that detachment, they won't interact in a normal way with all the Emperor's Children units, giving some rules and buffing abilities and things locked to the Emperor's Children keyword, like say who can embark in transports. That detachment does allow a bunch of stuff to target both sides of the army though, and Demon Princes can buff just general Slaanesh things too, so there is a tiny bit of overlap. At this point my guess is that this will be the replacement to taking allied demons from the Demons book. That's what happened for the Genestealer cult army. Their brood brothers were constrained to one detachment and no more freeform allies for the rest of them. We'll only find out that for 100% though when they eventually release the digital update for Chaos Demons as their index, which I'll certainly cover on the channel if and when they do. In general though, the upshot seems to be that Chaos Demons will have a pretty limited role in Codex Emperor's Children. The focus is going to be pretty squarely on the Space Marines for the most part, though there is still the option to field a Demonic and Space Marine allied list if that's what you'd like to do, and some of the rules in that detachment are pretty interesting in my opinion. Core things aside though, let's get to the detachments themselves. As mentioned in Codex Emperor's Children, there's 6 of them, some of them fairly general purpose, some of them a bit more specialist. First up, we've got the Coterie of the Conceited. This one represents a prideful warlord paying a kill tally for Slaanesh in exchange for some pretty massive demonic boons. There's a Slaanesh's Chosen detachment, which are characters trying to outdo each other to earn their deity's favour, so a big character focus there. There's the Mercurial host, which is fairly speed focused. Emperor's Children units just moving extra fast in various different ways with some redeploy style things. The Rapid Evisceration is a transport themed detachment, so things jumping out of rhinos and land raiders. The Peerless Bladesmen is a melee themed detachment, so great for things like flawless blades or infractors and a few others. And the Carnival of Excess is with allied demons. Take the army roughly half and half, and there's buffs for both things. The demons are the only things that are locked to one detachment. You can take everything else in all of them. Though as with a lot of codexes, some detachments support things a lot better than others. Say for example, Rapid Evisceration isn't really going to do much for your army if it's not jumping out of a transport. Let's get into the detachments themselves though, and first up we have the Coterie of the Conceited, and as mentioned that this one represents the force of one powerful Chaos Warlord who's made some bold wagers and boasts to Slaanesh, and now he actually needs to come good on his promises, win a great victory against the enemy, and feed a lot of sacrifices to his deity, or otherwise he's going to be facing punishment. The core rule for this one is pretty fun. It's called Pledges to the Dark Prince. The Warlord must be on the board to function, so you basically have to try and keep them alive, maybe meaning that you'd have to play extra cagey with that model. And if your Warlord is on the board, then at the start of the turn you can make a kill tally pledge to Slaanesh, naming the amount of units that you're going to kill this battle round, and then over the battle round you need to kill that many units or more. If you kill less than that, then your Warlord takes D3 mortal wounds. A couple of turns of that being failed, and it could kill a normal inventory sized character if you're unlucky. At the end of the battle round though, if you do kill that many units or more, then you make your pledge and you gain the pact points. Say if you pledged 2 units and you killed 3 of them, then you gained 2 pact points, as that's how many you pledged, and they're counted up over the course of the game, and for each of these levels that you pass you get an additional buff. If you've got 1, then you get to reroll hits of 1. If you've got 3, then your whole army gets to reroll wound rolls of 1 as well. If you've got 5 or more, then your melee gets dead scary, but getting both sustained and lethal hits in melee all the time. And then if you get to 7 or more, then your melee also gets even scarier with critical hits on a 5+. That does apply to shooting as well, but it would work really well with the sustained and lethal hits, with them going off a load. It's really quite an interesting and potentially quite powerful detachment rule, though you're only going to get to the really big damage buffs towards the end of the game. On round 1 there's a pretty reasonable chance that you might not be able to kill anything, particularly if you happen to be going first and the enemies hit a bunch of stuff, though I guess if you go second they might have had to push up and put things on objectives. You really do need to try and get the ball rolling as fast as possible though. I think you'd hope you'd have at least the both sets of rerolls by battle round 3, and hopefully getting the melee one as soon as possible, as after that you're just getting ridiculously excessive amounts of damage there, and hopefully could be rapidly trying to clean up the enemy army as fast as possible in the last few turns of the game if things are going well. I guess you could use some of the scouting and fast hitting things to try and get some easy kills, maybe things like Infractors with their scout move. You might be able to hit some infiltrators or outlying stuff. And you could potentially put the Warlord as something that's a bit more durable. Maybe Lucius or Fulgrim could take the D3 mortal wounds more reliably if you did get unlucky on a round. Definitely quite a fun detachment rule. I feel like the biggest weakness is if you get unlucky and something just lives when it really should have died. That could be really quite catastrophic if you just manage to miss out on your pledge, never mind the extra damage that you take on your Warlord. Going through the stratagems for that detachment, first up for 1 CP we've got Protection of the Dark Prince. This one's a 6+ feel no pain or a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds this phase. That one's not really super exciting for the 6+ version. Could be okay for say damage 3 things going into Terminators or Flawless Blades perhaps, just so they don't neatly kill a unit so easily. The mortal wound protection is quite a nice one though. If the opponent's just about to hit you with a whole bunch of devastating wound weapons, maybe that could be worth it. For 1 CP, there's Embrace the Pain. This one's a melee manipulation one, and each enemy model that's in engagement range must attack this one nominated Emperor's Children infantry unit in the fight phase. So I guess the idea would be that you could charge 2 Emperor's Children units into a thing, one that's more expendable, and then maybe force a great big model like, say, Angron or an Imperial Knight or something to dump all their attacks into the thing that doesn't matter, and then the actual scary melee stuff can get to work. Definitely a powerful melee manipulation one, this one. For 1 command point, there's Unshakable Opponents. This one allows you to ignore modifiers to your ballistic skill, weapon skill, hit and wound rolls, and you trigger it in the command phase, and it lasts until the end of the turn. If you're fighting against some things with some inbuilt stealth or -1 to hit, it's nice enough. This one kind of depends on what you're fighting though. I feel like the biggest impact could be if it makes the difference between the wound roll, as usually that's going to be a little bit more impactful. Definitely nice to have, but also won't be relevant in every game if your opponent doesn't have those rules on the go. For 1 CP, there's Martial Perfection, reroll hit rolls in the fight phase. I feel like this one will be better in the other detachments really, particularly given that you get easy access to army-wide reroll hit rolls of 1 as soon as you get 1 pact point. I guess maybe it could be handy for something like Infractors trying to bully an enemy unit out early and trying to get the ball rolling. After that though, it's going to be limited value. Some of the biggest melee damage dealers, such as Fulgrim, the Flawless Blades, and maybe the Lord Exultant, they all hit on 2s anyway, so if they're hitting on 2s and rerolling 1s, it's not going to help them. Next up for 1 command point, we've got Unbound Arrogance. After destroying a unit in your shooting phase or the fight phase, you get to increase your pledge number by 1, and you can only do this once per battle round. This one's the one to go for if you've gone over your tally but you still want the reward. So say if you pledged 2 units and then you wound up killing a 3rd one because you got lucky, this means that you can reap the reward of getting that extra pact point. I guess as well, maybe if you thought you weren't going to be able to kill anything this turn and you happened to get lucky, this could be one way of getting that without taking the D3 mortal wound hit to your Warlord. Finally, for 1 command point, we've got Armour of Abhorrence, and this one's basically Armour of Contempt, worsening the AP of an attack by 1 this phase, and that'll only affect 1 enemy unit due to the balanced data slate ruling. So if you had, say, a unit with a bunch of heavy bolters shooting at your unit with AP -1, that'd instead be AP 0. That one's generally a pretty handy one to have. Very nice for 2+ save units. It's either good in melee or good against big hitting shooting units, particularly when stacked with cover. Compared with its previous version though, it's not quite as nice if you've got a whole bunch of different enemy shooting units or focusing fire on one of your own. Overall though, not a bad set of stratagems I think. The Armour of Contempt equivalent is nice to have, and the forcing the enemy to hit 1 unimportant unit is pretty good. maybe the rest just being a little bit lower yield or more niche. For the enhancements, they have a bunch of different pledges. The first one is the Pledge of Eternal Servitude, printed at 15 points. The first time the bearer is destroyed, take a leadership test. If it's passed, then you set them up back on the table with d6 wounds remaining at the end of the phase. They're not more wounds than they started with. This one seems like quite nice insurance to keep a warlord alive if you chose a generic character. I guess it means that you might be able to use them a little bit more aggressively and not be a complete disaster if they do get killed. Still maybe feels a little bit shaky to rely on though with the leadership thing. In general though, it could just be handy enough just for something like a Lord Exultant to come back and have another go with a bit more fighting if they did play aggressively and got lain low. Next up, we've got the Pledge of Dark Glory. That's printed at 30 points unless Games Workshop change things in the digital update. That one's +1 leadership and +1 OC for their lead unit. I guess that'll give you a bit of extra weight on objectives. Maybe could be alright for Noise Marines or Terminators that don't have so much OC. At 30 points though, I feel like that would be too pricey for what it gives. Next up, there's the Pledge of Mortal Pain, printed at 15 points. This one's a fun one to potentially throw out some mortal wounds if the opponent gets unlucky. At the start of the shooting phase, select one enemy unit within 12 inches and visible. They take a leadership test with -2 if battle shocks, and if they fail the test, then they take 3 mortal wounds. It's definitely quite an unreliable one, but just every so often you'd throw a fairly significant amount of damage into an enemy unit. If it does wind up being 15 points, it could be nice enough as a points filler. Just not really the sort of thing that you could rely on, but every so often it is going to do something at least somewhat significant. Finally, we've got the Pledge of Unholy Fortune. That's printed at 25 points, and in my opinion this one's probably the best out of any of them. Once per turn you can change a hit, wound or saving throw to an unmodified 6 for the bearer's unit, and you do so after rolling, though you can't use it if your unit is battle shocked. That's just pretty excellent guaranteed value. As you can see that the test has been failed, and then you can just automatically make that failed test into a passed test and basically guarantee that you've saved a model's life there. Never mind anything else that you might do in terms of the actual damage bit of it, as it's once per turn. If you've got lethal hits or devastating wounds in the unit, then that's going to be quite easily reliable extra damage there. Overall, I would say that the detachment feels like an interesting one. The core rule definitely has a massive amount of power late in the game. It's maybe just the question as to whether or not you can get the ball rolling or not on all that damage. Maybe having to play super aggressive, maybe wanting to play at least somewhat aggressive to make sure you get the kills in early before committing the rest of the army to the fight with some ridiculous amounts of damage later on. For other things, I feel like the forcer units to attack one unit seems nice. There's plenty of reasonable enough situational stratagems, and this flip a dice to a 6-1 is also pretty good value. Before we move on to all the other detachments of the Prince of Pleasure, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold, one option for some magnetic carry cases, all made in the USA. Magnetic storage has certainly got very popular over the past few years in Warhammer, the idea being to attach magnets to your model's bases and attach them to a magnetic surface so that they don't slide around at all in transport, meaning that you can fit quite a lot all in one space without needing some firm insulation or anything like that, and without the danger of them rubbing or chipping off paint on each other. Tabletop Stronghold solution to this one are these mag cases. They're made of sturdy MDF, very hard to break when put together, and then have a whole bunch of steel trays that can be put on different levels throughout the case, so you can transport miniatures of different sizes, shapes and heights. They also have a nice acrylic sheet on the front as well, which is cool to keep the miniatures visible as they're being transported or stored and show off all your cool paintwork. Broadly speaking, they're pretty well reviewed, and there's been a lot of people I've seen satisfied with them, and they do have a sale on at the moment for 25% off. If you did want to give their stuff a look, they'll be linked in the video description. I'll also cycle back to them at the end of the video briefly. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Moving swiftly onwards though, next we have the Mercurial host, and this one's the Emperor's Children detachment, all about speed. This one always tends to be a common theme of Slaanesh, moving fast and never stopping the rush of sensation with Quicksilver reactions. The core rule of the detachment is called Quicksilver Grace, and it allows you to reroll advanced rolls for the Emperor's Children units, which I feel like isn't really the most exciting one in the world. You can advance, shoot and charge and things, and it would add up to a fair amount of extra movement over the course of a game. From a purely average dice roll point of view, or a d6, you typically get 3.5 inches on average, and with a reroll baked in then it goes up to more like 4.2, but perhaps more so than that it just adds a bit more reliability. As some insurance against just not rolling a 1 when you desperately need just a little bit more than that. It feels like a handy enough quality of life rule as opposed to usually going to be doing something particularly spectacular, and I guess it might save you a command point from time to time when it's critical. This one does feel like at least a fairly general purpose Slaanesh detachment though. Most of their units are generally wanting to move fast to deal their damage. For their stratagems, first up we have Violent Excess for 1 command point. This one gives you sustained hits 1 in the fight phase, a solid enough boost, usually a plus 25% damage boost if you're hitting on a 3+, or plus 20% if you're hitting on a 2, which a few of their units are. That one's easy enough to use, could be good on Infractors or Flawless Blades. For 2 CP, there's Combat Stims, that's a -1 to wound in melee for infantry. It is a good debuff, but also with a high price. I feel like 2 command points is often going to be a bit too much for that one. But if it's just absolutely critical that every single one of your models lives to be able to hit back hard, then it could be worth the price. For 1 command point, we've got Honour the Prince, which is an auto-advance 6 inches for infantry. It feels like there's maybe a little bit of anti-synergy there, given that that just sort of overrides the whole point of re-rolling the advances to give a bit of reliability. But when you absolutely need to punch in the longest charge possible, it's there. The base troops move 7 inches, so you could have Infractors move 13 inches and then still charge after that, potentially scouting and then moving from one deployment zone to the next and crossing most of the table in a single turn if you want to, but just in general making longer charges more reliable. For 1 command point, we've got Dark Vigor, which I feel like could potentially be one of the best ones out of the detachment. This one's a reactive move of 6 inches, and it's a normal move, and you trigger it whenever an enemy movement ends within 9 inches in their movement phase. You can't use it on beasts or vehicles, though Spawn get a similar rule anyway. Reactive moves are pretty excellent in Warhammer 40k. You can use them to hide some infantry, or recoil from a charge and make a charge not happen when otherwise you might have lost a unit. You could push a unit up to objective to be able to contest it, or even move to charge block a unit and stop them charging what they want to. You can use this on some very significant and very scary things. Flawless Blades or Infractor combos or Fulgrim himself could all be good targets, and I have a feeling that this will get used really quite a lot in this detachment. For 1 command point, there's Capricious Reactions, a -1 to hit in the shooting phase. Always nice to have a reactive durability style stratagem when it's needed. And for 1 command point, we've got Cruel Raiders. An Emperor's Children unit can return to Strategic Reserve when they're within 9 inches of the board edge, and also not within 3 inches of enemy units. You trigger it, as with a lot of these options, at the end of the enemy fight phase. These ones are generally handy to have as well, meaning that you can get units around the back of the enemy and maybe be in a position to do secondary objectives or contest home objectives later in the game. You could also use it for a sort of first turn reserves arrival if you wanted as well. If the enemy goes first, then you could trigger this turn 1 and have your unit turn up in your turn 1. Maybe getting some lines of sight and range with Noise Marines perhaps. This one's another nice one for practical reasons, just good to be able to keep on pressing the attack when needed and be able to warp things around the board to places where they're not wanted. I feel like these ones are some pretty powerful stratagems, in particular that reactive move one. The return to reserves is handy, and there's a bunch of other ones that maybe aren't quite as high value but are just nice staples. -1 to hit, the auto advance 6, and the sustained hits in melee. Then we've got the enhancements for the Mercurial host though. Steeped in Suffering is 25 points, and the bearer's unit gets +1 to hit enemies below starting strength, and then also a +1 to wound if the enemy targets are below half strength. Could be nice enough for Noise Marines with a Lord Kakophonist, or perhaps Infractors with a Lord Exultant. In general, I think you'd usually be shooting for the +1 to hit with this one, maybe having to just chip a bit of damage with a bit of stray shooting before you commit your main guns. If it was 25 points though, I feel like it certainly wouldn't be particularly auto-include. Next up, we've got Intoxicating Musk, printed at 25 points. This one's a -1 to wound in melee for the bearer's unit if the attacker's strength is greater than your toughness. I guess for tanky units that you could use this on, it could be nice enough for the Terminators. They'd often be wounded on 3s or better for weapons that can properly threaten them, though it is maybe a shame that it only works in melee and not at range as well. Again, at 25 points, it seems a little bit on the borderline side. For 15 points, there's Tactical Perfection. This one allows you to redeploy 2 units after both players have set up, but before you know what is going to happen with first turn. This one could be nice in combination with the Tormentors maybe. Infiltrate units redeploying can be kind of handy after you've seen what the opponent's going to do, or even just deny space to their infiltrators and pull them back if that makes sense. It could just be nice to wrong foot the enemy though, maybe put some units down as bait for the opponents to try and set up in range of, and then pull them back somewhere safe. If it is just the 15 points or so, that one seems pretty fine value. Finally, we've got Loathsome Dexterity, printed at 10 points, and this allows your units to move through enemy models in the movement phase and auto-pass Desperate Escape tests, which could leave a bit more freedom for charge targets later in the turn, particularly if falling back. Maybe it could be good for an on-foot Demon Prince perhaps, or perhaps Infractors with a Lord Exultant. It would be nice for the Flawless Blades, but they don't have any units that can lead them that can take enhancements unfortunately. Overall, it feels like the detachment rule is a bit of a weakish one, but certainly not completely useless. The extra advances will stack up over the course of the game. A lot of the supporting rules in this one are really good though. Reactive moves and the return to reserves, useful extra speed, damage and defense when needed. I feel like the enhancements maybe aren't super standout, but redeploying units is handy enough. I feel like there is enough here to make this one interesting. Next up, we've got scary melee damage in the Peerless Bladesmen, and this one is the Emperor's Children detachment dedicated to glorious close combat, laying low the enemy's leaders and champions with some expert swordsmanship. The core rule gives you a melee damage buff on the charge. You either get lethal hits or sustained hits 1. Quite nice to be able to flex them out depending on your targets. As usual, if you're wounding on a 5+ or worse, it usually makes sense to go lethal hits, and if you're wounding on a 3+ or better, sustained hits tends to win. The vast majority of the damage dealers in Codex Emperor's Children are melee ones, so this one certainly feels like it has the potential to be one of the most interesting detachments. For the stratagems, for 1 command point, we've got Deft Parry. This one's a -1 to hit in the fight phase. Nice enough reactive durability there, but not standout valuable really. And it's not going to help you against gunline armies that just want to shoot down your nice bladed champions. For 2 command points, we've got Death Ecstasy. This is an expensive one that gives you fights on death, triggered just after an enemy unit has declared their targets. That one's pretty huge to allow things like Flawless Blades or a fighty character to go down swinging. Maybe even Lucius the Eternal or Fulgrim himself if they came unstuck. Really handy to have if you're facing a melee foe where the majority of their units are going to have to try and kill yours in close combat, and with scary melee units like the Emperor's Children have, this could allow you to take out entire units as yours get killed. For 1 CP, there's Incessant Violence. This one's a consolidated of 6 inches, provided the unit ends in engagement range of something. This could be nice to allow you to kill one thing and then tag the next, which could be quite disruptive to enemy infantry shooting units and the like. For 1 command point, there's Cruel Bladesmen, and this one's an AP boost. One unit that charged this turn gets better AP by 1, and this could be a really big one against things with high saves. Could be good for Terminators, perhaps the Infractors, given that they have a whole bucket load of AP -1 attacks. They're going to be way more general purpose, and particularly with a Lord Exultant attached. Fulgrim could get up to AP -4 with his big attack, as could the Flawless Blades. It could be nice for Mauler Fiends going after tough stuff as well. I feel like this one has the potential to be used a lot, particularly against certain armies like, say, Space Marines. For 1 command point, there's Terrifying Spectacle. This one's in the enemy command phase, and you basically force a battle shock test if you've killed something in melee with one of your units that's nearby an enemy one. Being in the enemy command phase makes that a lot more useful than most battle shock tests tend to be, as it could directly deny some primary objective in the right situation and prevent stratagems and give them fallback problems for the rest of the turn. This one's not in the battle shock section of the command phase as well, so I don't believe they'll be able to use the auto pass stratagem. Could be good to go after something that could be a really high value target for that, but unfortunately for battle shock most of the time they'll just pass the test anyway, so it has to be impactful enough to have a low chance of it be worth it. Finally, for 2 command points, we've got Cut Down the Weak. This one is a bit of a surprise move after the enemy falls back. 1 unit besides non-walker vehicles within 6 inches can basically charge as soon as the enemy units fallen back, provided they're within 6 inches. It sounds like you can also nominate other units as the target of that charge, though you do have to nominate the one that fell back. And if you do charge in this way, then you don't get the Fights First charge bonus, but that might not matter for certain units, say particularly Fulgrim with his Fights First or Lucius the Eternal. This one does have the potential to be a bit of a gotcha one, and probably one to make your opponent aware of. Though even if they do have full awareness of this, it might not always be possible to avoid it, say if you've wrapped around an enemy unit a bit, or they just have a 5-inch movement or less, or there's terrain in the way or something. This one could be a very nasty way to basically get an enemy unit killed in their own turn, and potentially even hide your infantry unit from enemy shooting while doing so. It does cost a big 2 CP though, and without much command point generation in the Emperor's Children army, you would really have to pick and choose your options here. Definitely some interesting ones out of the stratagems though. I feel like that extra AP on the charge one feels like it could be one of the most easily used ones. Fights on Death is pretty nice to access, maybe in particular for those Flawless Blades. A few of the others are reasonable enough staple ones to add a bit of value, and that surprise charge one is a very nasty one. For the enhancements, first up we have Faultless Opportunist. This one's printed at 10 points, and you can 0 CP Heroic Intervention, and use that stratagem even if something else in your army has used it already. Heroic Intervention definitely isn't bad. It's occasionally big, but it won't come up every game though. Could be okay for a points filler for a fighty character if nothing else is being taken. For a massive 35 points, there's Blinding Speed, and this one's a once per game Fights First. So it basically means that your opponent would have to second guess whether or not they really want to charge your unit, as they might just take a massive chunk out of them before they get to hit them. Maybe it could be good for a Lord Exultant in a unit of Infractors perhaps. Again, would be great to get that in Flawless Blades, but there's no characters that can put it there. I guess it could make a Demon Prince hard to charge as well. At 35 points though, it is a significant investment. I feel like with the units that you can put it on, they're maybe just not the all-destroying things that you really need for Fights First to be ridiculously effective. Next up, we've got Distortion, which is a +1 attack and +1 damage to the bearer's melee weapons. The Lord Exultant can be incredibly scary with his lethal hits, wound rerolls from Infractors, and a big turn of extra hits, and having him at damage 3 and an extra attack on top of that is just massive. Feels like that would be a very tempting choice for him along with a unit of Infractors here. You could make an extra fighty Demon Prince as an alternative though with damage 4. Finally, we've got Rise to the Challenge, printed at 30 points. This one's infantry only, and it basically allows you to fight again at the end of the fight phase if there's at least 3 models within engagement range. You can only use it once per game, and when you're doing so though, you can use one of the detachment rule buffs as well, so sustained hits or lethal hits. I feel like for 30 points you probably want a more de-restricted fights again. This one occasionally could be absolutely enormous when it does trigger against something that's really meaningful, and your lord hasn't got killed by an enemy unit on the counter-attack. But the 3 models in engagement range could be a bit killer. The opponent could just defeat it by spreading out their models a bit, or by removing certain models when they pull casualties, and it just won't be usable against any one big single model. Still, I guess could be interesting enough for a ridiculous amount of attacks out of a Lord Exultant on his big go turn with extra attacks. I feel like only really being effective against some ranked up infantry units is going to make this one less tempting. Overall though, I feel like this could be one that a bunch of people gravitate towards. Just getting things like sustained hits on Flawless Blades and Infractors with a Lord Exultant is a big damage boost and makes them way scarier. As mentioned, like the extra AP, the charge down at fleeing enemies, and the fights on death for melee armies. And the enhancements are at least interesting. I feel like that Distortion Sword might be the easiest pickup, though the Rise to the Challenge and the Blinding Speed both could be massive deals in the right combat. Though if they do remain 30 points or more, they might just be a little bit less auto-include. Overall seems like a scary detachment though, particularly given how dangerous the Flawless Blades can be. Next up though, let's talk about the detachment rule for the Emperor's Children and the Demons of Slaanesh fighting side by side, and their detachment is called the Carnival of Excess, and this one's the allied detachment that gives you some synergies for the Legion of Excess Demons units. The detachment rules allow you to take the Legions of Excess units up to half of your points values, so that would be say up to 1,000 points worth of the Demon Datasheets in a Strike Force game, or 500 at Incursion. The Demon Datasheets can't be the Warlord, so you can't have Shalaxi or Keeper of Secrets as your designated one there, and the ones on offer as mentioned are Shalaxi Hellbane, the Keeper of Secrets, Seekers, Fiends and Demonettes. For the actual main boosting rule, the core rule is that the Demons and the Emperor's Children units empower each other within 6 inches. While the Emperor's Children are within 6 inches of the Legion of Excess units, they're empowered and they get sustained hits 1 on all their weapons, both range and melee, so quite a good general purpose boost there. And if they happen to already have sustained hits 1, they get critical hits on a 5+ as well, so Fulgrim will be hitting with sustained hits on a 5+. And the same works for the other way around as well. The Emperor's Children also empower the Demons units, so a whole bunch of those will get sustained hits mainly in melee for them. As it goes, it's a fairly solid and easy enough damage buff to access. Perhaps the biggest challenge might be to try and keep them charging in unison with each other, as with big movement characteristics and long charges, you might have some things getting isolated. If you lose some units as well, and say you lost a bunch of demon units in one area of the board, it does mean that you could have far less options in terms of stratagems and just raw damage output. Talking of stratagems though, first up for 1 command point we have Sustained by Agony. This one's triggered when an Emperor's Children unit slays an enemy unit in the fight phase, and 1 Legions of Excess Demons unit within 6 inches gets 3 wounds healed to itself, or you regenerate D3+3 Demonette models if you'd lost them in the squad. As healing stratagems go, I feel like 3 wounds or potentially around 5 Demonettes is a pretty valuable one. It maybe feels like the sort of thing that's just going to happen opportunistically from time to time though, as in general it's going to make sense to have those units near each other anyway to activate those damage buffs. For 1 command point there's Ecstatic Slaughter. This one's similar, but for Legion of Excess units destroying an enemy unit in the fight phase, 1 Emperor's Children unit within 6 inches of them and not in melee can then declare a charge. That's really quite interesting, potentially being able to even get a second charge in a turn, say if they've fought and destroyed their unit, or the Demons and the Emperor's Children both charge the same target, and then the Demons unit just wiped out the thing that they charged. You could then empower the Emperor's Children unit nearby to go on and charge something else and still deal their damage. You aren't allowed to fight a second time if you've already activated in the fight phase, but you could still use the second charge for gaining movement even if you didn't want to even make the attacks. Definitely feels like this one might have some pretty interesting potentials. Like I said, you could have a demon unit and an Emperor's Children unit both charge a unit of chaff. The demons wipe out the chaff, and then the Emperor's Children unit goes on to charge the thing behind the chaff. That feels pretty nasty there. Or you could use it to throw models around in terms of tying up enemy units after, or contesting an objective if you could. That one feels interesting, and maybe one just to look out for opportunistically, or maybe could potentially try and set that up if there's something that you can wipe out reliably. For one command point, there's Violent Crescendo. In the fight phase, one beast's infantry or mounted unit can pile in and consolidate 6 inches. And when you do so, you can move closer to the closest unit rather than the closest model, and you have to trigger this before they've actually fought or anything so you don't know their damage. That's really quite a lot more movement in the fight phase potentially. You could use it to lock up another threat if you're going to wipe out a unit and then consolidate 6 inches to tie something up that doesn't want to be in close combat. You could use the bonus movement to get to an objective, or you could get more models into engagement range to fight with the enemy. That could be handy enough for a big squad, or one where the 3-inch isn't going to be enough to get you to pile in properly. For one command point, there's Sycophantic Surge. A Legions of Excess unit can charge when they advanced or fell back, provided that the target of their charge is in melee with an Emperor's Children unit already. That could give you a few more interesting options, and again it's very much fighting alongside with them. I guess that means that you could both have the Legions of Excess and also the Emperor's Children units both advancing and charging alongside each other. So they could both keep up the speed with advance and charge, and then even maybe go on to trigger that other stratagem after they've fought in melee with those big damage buffs. For one command point, there's a nice simple Uncanny Reactions, -1 to hit this Slaanesh unit in the shooting phase, so usable on both the Demons and the Emperor's Children. Always nice to have a reactive durability stratagem around. As ever, these will be better against things with lower ballistic skill typically. And finally, there's an interesting though pricey one called Dark Apparitions for 2 CP. This one's usable on the Demonettes, and you use it when they're not in engagement range, and they can return to reserves at the end of the enemy fight phase. Usually that would be just one command point to do that, but for this one they also have the bonus rule that when they return, they can turn up anywhere that's greater than 6 inches from the enemy rather than 9, provided they are within 9 inches of an Emperor's Children unit. Essentially they get close range deep strike and are still able to charge after doing that, provided they've got some Space Marines around to set it up. I guess you could have an Emperor's Children unit move a long way forward with their advance move before you even get to deep strike them, so you could have a good threat range on the table to set this up with, and then you could drop the Demonettes down and just have them ready to just delete a unit of chaff, or maybe jump onto an enemy home objective and sweep it clear. At 2 CP for this one though, it does feel like you'd have to think a fair bit ahead, as you'd really have to know that it was worth it, and also be weighing it up against all the other options that you'd be giving up by spending those 2 CP on this. Feels like there's some interesting enough stratagems though. I think that bonus charge one could definitely be interesting for Ecstatic Slaughter. The extra consolidate's an always handy one to have for a melee army. And the -1 to hit one and the healing ones, they feel like they'll at least fairly reliably turn up to have some value. Finally for this one, we've got the Enhancements. Empiric Suffusion is free heroic interventions. This one's for an Emperor's Children model and allows 1 unit per turn to get a free heroic intervention when they're within 6 inches of that model. I guess that's handy enough to have in the middle of a formation and could allow the units to support each other, which does seem to be the theme of the detachment. Could be big on anything with fights first, like Lucius or Demonettes or Fulgrim. Dark Blessings has an Emperor's Children infantry model gaining a 3+ invulnerable save this phase, triggered after the enemy has just selected its targets, and only usable once per battle. I guess that could allow a Lord Exultant, Lord Kakophonist, or a Sorcerer to be unusually tanky for a turn even if their retinue gets gunned down. They still get a 4+ invulnerable save anyway though, and you would need to preempt it to know when their squad is going to go down in flames. The Possessed Blade feels like quite a good one. An Emperor's Children model gets +1 attacks in melee, and then you've got the option to sort of overcharge the weapon and use the demon bit of it, I guess. This makes your attacks hazardous, but each time you fight you also get +1 damage and devastating wounds as well, which is rather massive, and that could make, say, a Lord Exultant just spectacularly fighty. You could also do it on a Demon Prince potentially, and even the Lord Kakophonist would enjoy that on a Power Sword, becoming damage 2 with that. That one does seem like a really nice one. Finally, we've got Warp Walker, which is an Emperor's Children or Keeper of Secrets model, so the only one that you can put on the Demons. For a model with this, you get to add 6 inches to your movement when you advance rather than rolling, so nice reliable, really long charges. Emperor's Children can advance and charge, and Demons are able to with that stratagem. When they make normal moves, fall back, and advance moves, they get to move through enemy models, and they get to auto-pass Desperate Escape tests as well, which sometimes can come in handy. Feels like that could make Keepers of Secrets or melee units really quite hard to screen out. You could be able to jump over screening units and get close to your prey. or just have really long threat range with the auto 6 advance thing. Overall seems really quite nice. Overall, I think there's enough here to be interesting. The core damage buff is helpful to both sides of the army. Even just getting that reliably on things like Flawless Blades or Noise Marines seems genuinely quite handy. Some of the stratagems are really interesting, though maybe in a little bit more of a technical melee way, as opposed to just adding sheer amounts of raw damage or speed. And after the enhancements, I think my favourite is that Possessed Blade there. Getting +1 attack in melee, along with +1 damage and devastating wounds is all rather nice. I certainly want that on an Emperor's Children character in this one. Moving on, and next up we have the transport themed detachment, and this one is the rather brutally named Rapid Evisceration. The Emperor's Children don't exactly have loads of transports to choose from, so this one's basically going to be entirely around infantry fighting in Rhinos and Land Raiders, at least for the things that gain benefits from the detachment rules. The core rule for this one is Mechanized Murder. Units that disembark from a transport this turn get to reroll hit rolls and wound rolls of 1. So if you didn't have any of those going on already, that's usually a flat 36% boost to your damage output. It's a bit less potent for the Infractors in particular though, given that they already reroll wound rolls of 1 innately. I feel like the damage boost does help out a fair bit. It is kind of dependent on the Emperor's Children units just having good synergy with transports overall in the first place though. The extra durability that they can give is handy enough, though with the army rule the extra speed maybe isn't needed quite so much compared with some. If you're able to move quite fast in the first place, then advance and shoot and advance and charge, transports just aren't going to add quite as much value as they otherwise would do. Terminators and Flawless Blades can only be transported in Land Raiders as well, so no jumping out of Rhinos for them, and Land Raiders are certainly a pretty massive extra commitment. Beyond the core damage boost rule though, there's a bunch of other stuff going on. For one command point we've got On to the Next. This one triggers when an Emperor's Children unit kills something in the fight phase, and your Emperor's Children unit is wholly within 6 inches of a transport at the same time, and it means they can immediately embark into that transport if there's room for them. This one in theory is quite nice. If you can have a unit get out, kill an enemy unit dead, and then get back into their ride, that's a good way to keep them safer from enemy retaliation and also set them up for a bigger threat range next time. The biggest challenge might be for your transports to keep up with the melee unit as it's moving around and fighting. That's particularly with things like advanced and charges and big movement on the go. The unit might just outpace the transport and not be wholly within 6 inches when it does its fighting. For one command point there's Advance and Claim. A Tormentors unit and a transport can use their sticky objectives while embarked. I feel like this one isn't really a great one to be honest. Tormentors and their Infiltrate special rule just generally don't really need to be in transports. They likely want to be either starting on the mid board to secure one of the objectives or on the home objective to sticky it straight away. Neither of which really wanting to be in transport, and instead of using this stratagem they could just get out if they really wanted to activate that rule. For 1 CP we've got Dynamic Breakthrough. An Emperor's Children vehicle unit can move through enemy models besides monsters and vehicles, and auto passes Desperate Escape tests. I guess it could allow for transports to get to unusual locations. Maybe if there's enough room to land a Rhino the other side of a screening unit, then that could be something. Perhaps Mauler Fiends feel like another interesting use for that though. If you had enough movement you might be able to get to places that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. It still does feel a bit niche though. I feel like this one would be so much more interesting if it allowed you to move through terrain pieces like several other detachments allow you to. For one command point we've got Ceaseless Onslaught. A unit that disembarked from a transport that made a normal move can still charge. Land Raiders get this one anyway, so it's just for Rhinos this one. So you could have a Rhino move 12 inches, drop some Infractors out the front for another 3 inches, and then charge I guess an average of 7. So a 22 inch threat range there more or less. It is interesting, but if they are able to advance and charge, and there's nothing in the detachment rule that's getting them in the way of that, they still have around about a 20 inch average threat range just from getting out, moving, advancing normally, and then charging. So again, this one maybe just feels a little bit niche on the use case side of things. For one command point, we've got Reactive Disembarkation. An enemy unit shoots your transport, and then your Emperor's Children unit can immediately get out somewhere within 6 inches of the transport, if it makes sense to in the enemy turn. Quite a lot of the time it wouldn't really make sense to in the enemy turn, given that your unit could just then get shot by something else or charged by something. You're giving up your protection of the transport, so you'd have to have a good reason to do that. Maybe getting out the unit safely into terrain if otherwise they wouldn't be able to if the transport just got destroyed with the extra movement. Or I guess you could do clever things like potentially set them up for heroic intervention, or put a bunch of models on an objective marker. Again though, often feels like you might just be able to keep the unit in the transport, maybe the transport survives, or maybe they can get out to safety if not anyway. Finally, for one command point, we've got Outflanking Strike. Transports wholly within 9 inches of a board edge can return to reserve at the end of the opponent's fight phase. 1 Land Raider, or up to 2 Rhinos. Again, Return to Reserves is a pretty handy one to have, means that you could be getting threat into the enemy deployment zone sometime later in the game, or you could use this first turn for potentially first turn reserve arrival if the opponent went first. Transports are allowed to move onto the edge of the board and then disembark their cargo to do a bit of shooting. Feels like you could deliver some Noise Marines that way if you wanted. You'd have to weigh that up just versus where the transports could move anyway though. They generally do have fairly good movement characteristics, and you might not have all that much options as to where you set them up. They've got quite big profiles, so you're not going to be able to land them in small gaps. The opponent might have been able to screen places, and mean that you might not gain that much movement with this. It's still a fairly interesting one though. For the stratagems here, a bunch of them do have some pretty interesting movement options, though I just feel like quite a lot of them are pretty niche to the point where they just don't really directly help you out with the main thing that you'd usually want to be doing with the transport units, even if every so often one or more of them could come in clutch. The re-embark one's certainly impactful if you can have the transport in a pickup point, maybe charging the enemy unit alongside the unit that got out of it perhaps, and the return to reserves thing is interesting again, though as mentioned does have its downsides. Finally, for the enhancements for the rapid evisceration, first up we've got Sublime Presence. This one's an infantry model only, and it allows you to arrive a transport model from a strategic reserve as if it were 1 round higher. So if you just put one into strategic reserve normally with some contents inside it, it could be turning up in the mid-board on round 1 or the enemy deployment zone in round 2 if there's space. If anything, it feels like there's perhaps a bit of an overlap with the stratagem option though. 1 out of every 2 games you could have Rhinos turning up in the mid-board turn 1 anyway, and not have to commit to anything pre-game. For 20 points, there's Spearhead Striker. When this model's unit disembarks from a transport, you get to ignore Overwatch and reroll charges. Pretty nice threatening support to move up paired with their damage buffs. It means that you could get Noise Marines out somewhere that could eat some big Overwatch and have them in safety there. Seems like it could be okay if that's a big threat to you for a Lord Kakophonist perhaps. Printed at 35 points, there's Accomplished Tactician. This one's infantry only, and 1 Emperor's Children unit within 9 inches in the shooting phase can re-embark on a transport after an enemy unit has shot them and hit them with at least 1 attack. I guess that's probably going to be easiest to set up on the bearer's own unit. So again, maybe you could have a Lord Kakophonist getting out of a Rhino alongside a bunch of Noise Marines, and then know that 1 enemy unit would be able to shoot them, but no more than that if they do have a transport nearby and they can't pop that easily. If it does turn out to be 35 points in the final version though, that seems like a massive amount to pay for this ability. Finally, there's Heretic Adept, and this one's for an infantry model once again. This one defends Emperor's Children vehicles within 6 inches, and once per turn 1 vehicle within that range can change a failed save's damage characteristic to 0. So say if you had a Land Raider that got hit by a las cannon, failed its armor save, and then that damage would do 0 rather than d6 plus 1, so quite a lot of wounds saved there potentially. Feels like that's probably going to be most impactful for Land Raiders or perhaps Mauler Fiends. I feel like it would be an easier one to use if they had things like, say, some gun tanks to support though. That feels like the sort of thing that most enjoys that kind of buff. Overall, I'm maybe a bit skeptical as to how well received this one will be. It's just quite limited in terms of datasheets, even within the confines of this codex. And maybe the biggest problem feels like the transports just have a bunch of anti-synergy with the whole advance and shoot and advance and charge things going on, as you just don't need the speed quite so much. And then even on top of that, a lot of the stratagems just don't seem like they're going to be reliably useful all that often. I'd say maybe the best thing about the detachment just feels like the big boosted damage when you get out of transport. That certainly feels very nice for Noise Marines, and maybe is one of the most easy and predictable ways to get them extra sonic firepower. I suspect that this one might be received as a bit weaker than some of the rest. There certainly could be an annoying army to fight with a bunch of units that want to jump back in transports in all kind of ways, and if the transports get popped, then maybe getting them out into safety. Finally, for detachments, we have Slaanesh's Chosen, and this one represents a bunch of characters trying to outdo each other, basically trying to achieve the best they can in the battle, draw their god's favour with great acts of valour and perfection, and reaping a bloody tally on the enemy while they do so. The core rule for this one is called Internal Rivalries. First up, the smaller part is that characters get to ignore modifiers to move, advance and charge. Not nothing, but kind of niche on its own, given that not every army has those debuff style rules. And even then, it's not necessarily that they're going to target your character units with those, but the bigger part of the rule is called Favoured Champions. At the start of the game, your Warlord unit is the favoured champion, and whenever your favoured champions make an attack, they get to re-roll the wound roll. That's really quite a mighty damage buff, particularly against stuff that have high toughness, and that's what they take to survive. And you could have that on some seriously scary units, say Fulgrim himself re-rolling wound rolls all the time, or a Lord Kakophonist leading a whole bunch of Noise Marines. As the game goes on though, if another one of your character units gets a kill, so destroys an enemy unit, then that unit now becomes your favoured champions from now on until something else gets a kill to steal it back again. I feel like the switching thing is maybe kind of unhelpful though for actually getting those wound rolls active, as basically they'll steal the buff just after they've made their attacks, so usually that means they're not getting any of those wound rolls until the next turn once they've taken the buff from something else. I guess you'd want to make sure that you're attacking with your favoured champions early on if possible, so that you don't have something else steal their buff before they've got to attack with it. Overall, it's definitely an interesting big boost, but given that it just affects one unit in your army, it's going to be more impactful on smaller games versus bigger ones, just taking one unit and making it massively dangerous, potentially Fulgrim himself as mentioned. For stratagem options, these again all key off character units, as some have advantages either for the favoured champions or for the non-favoured champions. First up, for one command point, Beautiful Death, and that's a fights on death on a 4+, adding +1 to the roll if the squad is your favoured champions. Nice enough on any melee specialist, maybe Flawless Blades could be a particularly interesting one, and you could have them be your favoured champions via Lucius the Eternal if you wanted. Like the rest of the things in the detachment, it only works on character units though. For one command point, there's Heightened Jealousy. You use this when your new unit becomes your favoured champions. And then for the rest of the turn, all the other units that aren't your favoured champions gain a +1 strength on their attacks, both at range and in melee. And I guess if you've got a whole bunch of different character keyworded units, that could be a +1 strength buff to a pretty massive chunk of your army, lasting until the end of the phase. It maybe does feel like a little bit of effort to set up though. You'd be wanting to destroy something early in the phase, I guess, and you'd want to make sure that the actual +1 strength bracket actually made a difference against the targets that you were going into. Feels like the sort of one that could be absolutely great if all the stars aligned, but might not always be the easiest one to pull off. For one command point, there's Devoted Duelist. You select one enemy unit and all your character units that attack that unit this phase gain sustained hits 1 on their melee weapons. Just in general, getting sustained hits 1 is nice enough in the first place, could well be worth it on a big scary character-led squad. Flawless Blades or the Infractors with a Lord Exultant would enjoy that quite a lot, and it could pair pretty nicely with the wound rerolls as well. For one command point, we've got Diabolic Majesty. Just after a character unit becomes your favoured champions, each unit within 6 inches has to take a Battle Shock test at -1 to the test. Though you can only use this once per battle round, though I suspect you wouldn't normally want to be doubling down on this. Battle Shock tests in your own turn are usually only so helpful, and that's normally when your favoured champions rule is going to be swapping around. Though I guess it could potentially be preventing some stratagems or stopping them contesting a secondary objective from you or similar. For one command point, there's Refusal to be Outdone. This one's a +2 to charges for a character unit, charging an enemy unit that's already in engagement range with something else in your army. Could be handy enough for either long charges or charges from reserve, provided you've got another unit to set that up for you. I'd weigh that up versus a command point reroll though, as you don't have to commit the command point reroll until you've actually failed the charge. The +2 to charges will raise the chance of making the charge a bit higher than the CP reroll on higher values, like say 9 or more though. Finally, for one command point, there's Vengeful Surge. This one's a character unit that can make a surge move of d6 inches directly towards the closest enemy unit after it's been shot. Technically it's declared just after you were targeted, so you don't know exactly how much damage your opponent's going to do at that time. The d6 inches can be used to get into an engagement range, which could be absolutely enormous, and you get to reroll the dice if your character unit is currently not the favoured champions. This one's really quite a big one, as it means that all your scary character units can't really be safely approached on objectives, at least not unless the opponent's unit can afford just to have something walk into melee with them and hit them very hard in close combat. It could be really good on things like Lucius the Eternal or Fulgrim with their fights first. For infantry units, you could also use this to hide in melee as well, so enemy guns can't target them. Overall, I'd say that one's maybe got some of the claim to be one of the best stratagems in the detachment, and makes the enemy have to back off and change their plans. Otherwise, the sustained hits 1 in melee seems handy enough. Fights in death can be okay for a whole bunch of melee units, and I guess the +1 strength one could be situationally really quite good if you can get it set up and the strength differential actually matters. Finally, for Slaanesh is chosen, we've got the Enhancements. Eager to Prove is printed at 10 points. This one allows you to reroll charge rolls and give you a +2 inches to your movement while you're favoured champions. That could be quite a big threat range increase while you're favoured, though it's maybe a bit unfortunate you can't get that in Flawless Blades, given that they have to be led by Lucius the Eternal, who can't take enhancements. Repulsed by Weakness is printed at 25 points. When enemy models fall back from this unit, besides monsters and vehicles, they have to test Desperate Escape, and they have a -1 to the test if your unit's favoured. That could give your opponent some tough decisions, either stay in combat and risk getting wiped out, or lose a chunk of their unit from falling back, though bear in mind they can always choose the least bad option for themselves, maybe planning to countercharge or just accept a few casualties that don't really matter. It certainly could add a bit of extra value to tagging enemy units though. Printed at 20 points, there's Proud and Vainglorious. This allows you to reroll Battle Shock and Leadership tests and gives you +1 OC while the unit is the favoured champions. If the final price is cheap enough, it could make things like Noise Marines or Terminators better objective grabbers while they kill things. I feel like at 20 points for extra OC though, it's a bit take or leave. And finally for 15 points we've got Slayer of Champions. This one's printed at 15 points, and your melee weapons for your character gain precision and you boost the strength and AP of them by 1. But only when you're fighting enemy character units, so basically makes them into a big dangerous assassin. That seems like it will be good for a Lord Exultant or maybe a Demon Prince where they'd quite like the AP3 and precision. Feels like it could be a good points filler, but won't be reliably good in every game, as not every army has important characters to try and snipe out of units. Overall, again, it does feel like it's got some interesting stuff. I feel like there's some good value from the big reroll wound rolls thing, and that'll be starting on Fulgrim if you're playing with him, though could be on something else if you can have a different warlord. For stratagems, surge moves, sustained hits in melee and fights on death are all nice enough, and the enhancements feel okay but maybe feel a bit more points fillery as opposed to being enormously standout, and as mentioned, given the big buff to just one focal unit, it does look like it will be a detachment that's going to be better at lower points values versus really big games. Overall, the Emperor's Children have got a fair few different ways to go with detachments. I feel like most of them seem like they've got at least some interest going on for their different units. Maybe at first impressions, the Peerless Bladesmen seems like just some nice easy melee damage boosts. Given that they're an army that have so many dangerous melee units, that looks like it's going to be a bit of an easy winner for several people. Otherwise, Mercurial Host, just making the army go that little bit faster and then having some rather interesting redeploy style things does seem cool too. It's going to be interesting to see what people actually make of them and start putting on the table in competitive lists when the Codex does start to hit tournaments. I'll be interested to hear your takes as to which one you'd rate as highest down in the comments below. Moving on though, let's talk about the other half of the Codex and get on to the datasheets. And as World Eaters found out in 9th edition, going from being kind of a sub-faction of Chaos Space Marines to a standalone Codex meant that a lot of datasheets won't be fielded anymore for the Emperor's Children. There's all the normal and expected stuff with things like Raptors, Possessed, Havocs and Venom Crawlers, which are all locked to core Codex Chaos Marines. I don't think anyone was really expecting them to appear in the Emperor's Children book, but the unit list for the Emperor's Children was far more restrictive than the other deity codexes have been, at least in 9th and 10th edition. Notable omissions include any sort of big scary gun tank, Predators, Forge Fiends, Defilers and Hellbrutes. They do have the Land Raider, but that pays a premium for its transport capacity, and the Mauler Fiends to engage in close combat. Kind of weird to have that, but not the Forge Fiend really. Chaos Cultists are also a notable omission. Again, it does feel weird not to have them, to the point where I wonder if they're going to do some Slaanesh Cultists at some distant future release, but they're also not in the book, and that means that there's only things like Chaos Spawn for low-cost units for objective grabbing. There's also no Terminator characters as well, such as the Sorcerer, but you can still lead Terminator squads with the Lord Kakophonist. As mentioned earlier as well, if you wanted to field allied Slaaneshi demons, I guess the unit list that they can draw from has been drastically cut down. No named characters besides Shalaxi Hellbane, no Soul Grinder, no Chariot variants, and no Transweaver or Infernal Enrapturus. It certainly has been a bit of a big reset for the army. I think it's maybe not too surprising that they try and keep the focus on the unique units for the Emperor's Children, which I think is expected really, but at the same time could be a bit painful for existing collectors who've already had these models in their collections, particularly given the access of the other deity legions to these kind of datasheets, and a few of them do mean that Emperor's Children just aren't going to be playing it in certain ways. No access to long-range anti-tank firepower besides things like allied Wardog Brigands is going to force them to play in a certain way. For what is here though, here's a brief list of the datasheets. First up we've got the unique units, 4 characters in Fulgrim, Lucius the Eternal, the Lord Exultant and Kakophonist, and then 4 squads, the Tormentors and Infractors, Noise Marines and Flawless Blades. Then for the additions for the generic Chaos Space Marines, there's the standard Sorcerer and Power Armor, the Demon Prince and the Winged variant, Chaos Terminators and Chaos Spawn, and the Rhino, Land Raider, Mauler Fiend and Helldrake for the motor pool. Finally, as mentioned for the demons, we've got Shalaxi Hellbane, the Keeper of Secrets, and Seekers, Demonettes and Fiends. I mentioned it briefly earlier, but bear in mind that the printed points in the codexes aren't final. I feel like they're worth just bearing in mind, particularly for new units, but also Games Workshop could easily change them. and often tend to do so on a day 1 digital update, and their points will be in the Minotaur and Field Manual from then on. Sometimes the points cost can change really quite radically from the printed version to the one that they actually release. Say the Death Corps of Krieg Combat Engineers for the Guard going up from 35 points to 70. When talking through the datasheets, I'll both talk about the points cost from previous Codex Chaos Space Marines if there was one, and also the points cost printed in the book, but just bear in mind that they'll issue a digital points update, likely sometime in the next week or so, and I'll certainly cover that here on the channel when it's out. Let's get into the datasheets properly though, and talk through them all. We'll start with the unique Emperor's Children units, then go through to the generic Chaos Space Marine ones, and then to the Demons. We'll start out with the 2 battle line units for the Emperor's Children, and that's the Infractors and the Tormentors, and these are basically the legionary equivalents of the Emperor's Children, seeing as they move Noise Marines into more sort of the heavy support Havoc style role with some big firepower. The Infractors are the Thrill Seeker ones who want to charge headlong into combat and fight with their dueling sabres. They've got the standard Space Marine stat line with OC2, so some good pressure on objectives. They move a bit faster at 7 inches, and these ones also scout forward 6 inches as well. So they're going to be getting very quickly into the midboard and being able to scrap with their enemy peers. Their points cost are listed at 95 points for 5 of them, or 190 per 10. As mentioned though, it's certainly possible that that could change. For their damage, they're equipped with dueling sabres for the majority of the unit, 4 attacks that hit at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1 with precision. They all also get bolt pistols, and then the Obsessionist squad leader gets either a power sword, rapture lash, and can upgrade to a plasma pistol. The power sword is just basically the same, but with an extra pip of AP. The rapture lash instead has an extra 2 attacks, and that one probably seems like the best choice against the majority of targets. I'm not sure if the power weapon might be a typo, given that Space Marine power weapons usually tend to be strength 5 these days. Either way, broadly they have a whole boatload of attacks to clear out lighter infantry. One Infractor gets an Icon of Excess. If you kill an enemy unit when your unit's shooting or fighting, then you take a leadership test, and if it's passed then you gain 1 command point, which is rather nice. One of the only ways to farm command points in Emperor's Children. And their special rule is quite a nice one with Excessive Assault. You get to reroll wound rolls of 1 in melee. And then if your foe happens to be on an objective marker, you get to reroll all the wound rolls instead. That makes those bucket loads of AP1 damage 1 attacks far more threatening, and that can confer to attached characters as well, so could make a Lord Exultant just incredibly fighting. Overall they seem really quite solidly scary. I could see them being in rhinos with attached characters and then jumping out and hitting really quite hard after they've scouted forward to the midboard. They get on well with the detachments that can give them things like extra AP or sustained hits, and they've got a pretty massive charge threat range on turn 1, potentially being able to even get to things into the enemy deployment zone at least fairly reliably. The other troops choice for the Emperor's Children are the Tormentors. They're the sort of legionary equivalent, armed with bolters, and are the other build from the same kit as the Infractors. They've got the same stat line with a 7-inch move and OC2. They're also listed at 95 points per 5 of them, or 190 per 10. But instead of the Scouts keyword, these guys will be starting in the midfield if they want to, as they're infiltrators, or very nice to have to screen out the enemy and stop them putting their own scouts or infiltrators down where they're not wanted. It can be nice to have some presence on midboard objectives as well, and have units ready to do first turn secondaries. For their damage, or their ranged attacks get precision this time rather than the melee attacks of the Infractors, so they could still put some damage against characters. In theory, the majority of the squad's armed with bolt guns, but in reality it's going to be sort of half or the minority, given that per 5 of them you can take 1 melter gun and 1 plasma gun, so you can have both there, and the sergeant's armed with melee weapons, so you'll take a plasma pistol and either the power sword or rapture lash. They could chip in and maybe kill an elite infantry or 2, but their damage output really isn't great for the points at all. They also get that Icon of Excess, so could get a command point if they do manage to kill something. But just in general, there's lots of value for an infiltrator unit with OC2, so some good weight on objectives, and their special rule which is objective defiled. That means that they can put sticky objectives on the objectives in the midboard, and it remains under your control until the opponent controls that objective at the end of any phase. So it means that if they were on an objective in the open and got gunned down, it could still be yours, or if it made sense to, they could even move off it and go on to other targets, and it would remain yours if the opponent couldn't reach it. I feel like at least one unit of these seems to be pretty much auto-include. Just the utility of having an infiltrator style squad and sticky objectives and OC2 just feels like it'd get you a good leg up in the mission. I don't know if it might make sense to have another small 5-man squad as well. Maybe some lists will, but I feel like after one squad there's quite sharp diminishing returns, even if what the first one gets you is quite so good and useful. Definitely nice to have 2 troops choices that look genuinely pretty interesting in their own ways though. Continuing with their squads, let's take a look at the Noise Marines, the most iconic unit of the Emperor's Children. As mentioned, they've been basically reframed as sort of the Havoc equivalent of the Emperor's Children. Up-armoured Space Marines with great big sonic weapons. And as a result, their stat lines changed a bit. They're toughness 5 like the Havocs in Codex Chaos Space Marines, and they move 6 inches, but for this reason it's basically because they're fast Havocs as opposed to just normal Space Marine movement stats. In the new kit, there's exactly 6 of them, and one of them's the Squad Sergeant Disharmonist. You can't take any more or less than 6 in a squad, and their printed points cost is 135 points if you want to get their sonic firepower on the board. They're not battle line, so you can only take 3 units of them. For their weapons, 3 or 4 out of the 6 will take sonic blasters. Their new profile is 3 attacks, hitting on a 3 at strength 5, AP 1, damage 2, it ignores cover, and they're at 18-inch range. Ignores cover makes that AP -1 a lot more threatening. They'll absolutely be smashing through standard issue Space Marines with that, though it's not a profile that will worry everything with really high saves or high toughness values. The big threats in the units though are the 2 Blastmasters. They have been dropped in range all the way down to 18 inches, so they're basically a close support shooting squad as opposed to a long range one. Their big hits for the Blastmasters are 3 attacks at strength 10, AP -2 and damage 3 with ignores cover, really quite nice for frying enemy Terminators, and they've got enough strength and damage to stack some hurt on things like toughness 10 vehicles. If they happen to be going against lighter infantry, you can trade out their firepower for 6 attacks at strength 6 and AP 2 damage 1. Finally, the Disharmonist can take a Sonic Blaster, though you can swap that out for a Screamer Pistol. That's basically the same stat line, but with shorter range at 12 inches, and it gets the pistol keyword. The main advantage to taking that one though is that you get a bonus Power Sword, 4 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1. It doesn't seem like the worst trade-off in the world. You lose a little bit of range on one of your attacks, but get a tiny bit of melee. Feels like you could easily go either way there. Their special rule is really quite a disappointing one in Terrifying Crescendo though. It just means that one unit hit by the squad is -1 to their leadership and battle shock tests until the start of your next shooting phase. I guess potentially relevant if you reduce them to less than half health, it means they're a little bit likelier to break. Overall, they look like they're at least fairly solid shooting against sort of medium to heavy infantry with their damage profiles, and can chip in against vehicles a bit, though it maybe doesn't really feel like their absolute specialty given all those sonic blasters that might be wounding on 6s. They could be maybe interesting enough in rhinos to get around, and can be led by the Lord Kakophonist that we'll get onto in a second. Next up, we've got the Flawless Blades. These guys are the sort of possessed but not possessed for the Emperor's Children. Shock elite duelists who can take down the enemy champions with ease. They move 8 inches, have a toughness 5 with a 3+ save and a 5+ invulnerable, 3 wounds and OC1. The idea behind them is that they've received lots of boons of Slaanesh but aren't actually possessed, just more sort of augmented and mutated with all the gifts of chaos plus their own martial skills. You can take them in units of either 3 or 6, and their printed points cost is 130 points per 3 of them for their very general purpose melee. In close combat, they attack with their Bliss Blades. They're 3 attacks at weapon skill 2+, at strength 6, AP -3 and damage 2, so a profile that's just going to absolutely ruin just about any 2 wound infantry out there. They might have a slightly harder time against things like Terminators with 3 wounds and an invulnerable. Their special rule is a seriously powerful one though in Demonic Patrons. If you think that they're going to go against a target which they'll have trouble wounding, they have the option to call upon their Demonic Patrons when selected to fight. You don't have to, but if they choose to, they'll critical wound on a 3+, which basically means they'll wound anything in the game on a 3+, including the toughest things around like Knights and Land Raiders or Titans. The downside for this though is that they kill no models in the fight phase, so Slaanesh is displeased, and one model in the unit is just automatically destroyed. It does feel like this could be a genuine risk, given that the things they'd want to activate it against are the big tough stuff around, and you'd probably be wanting to throw them against the enemy's very toughest things to try and maximise their big damage. It does seem likely that sometimes they're going to fall short. For a unit of 6 of them, they should be a massive threat to pretty much anything out there. Their damage output is pretty good against just about everything, though only really stand out against 2 wound infantry still, I think. Say for example, if they're fighting something like a Predator tank, a unit of 3 of them averages around about 8 wounds in total to it. Definitely a big chunk out if they can make it to melee, but not necessarily one-shotting battle tanks unless you're taking a bigger unit or using detachment stratagems. They also notably can only be led by Lucius the Eternal as well, and he can't take enhancements, and that does lock them out of a few detachment synergies. They do look like they're going to be a focal unit in the Codex though. Really big reliable damage dealers that are quite fast with the detachment rule as well. Able to jump out, hit something very very hard, though they will be at least fairly easy to kill for the points in return. On to characters next, and we'll start with the big man himself. Demon Primarch Fulgrim has returned to cause carnage in Warhammer 40k, and his stat line certainly holds up to those of his brothers. Like Magnus and Angron, he's toughness 11 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save, a big 16 wounds, leadership 5+, and OC 6. He moves a little bit faster than them though, given the blessings of Slaanesh, so moves a big 16 inches with the fly keyword. If he's in the army, he must be your warlord, and for other supporting rules he's got deep strike, though in general I think it makes more sense just to keep him on the board. He does move fast enough to get where he needs to go. Deadly Demise D6 if he is slain and blows up, and he'll drop down to being -1 to hit if he is on 6 wounds or less, though still incredibly dangerous of course. His printed points cost is at 385 points, which seems fairly reasonable for him. He's certainly very fast and a big threat, and fights first makes him very hard to handle in close combat, but if he does get focused by a whole bunch of heavy firepower, his durability for the points cost isn't enormous. For his weapons he gets a Malefic Lash, 6 attacks at strength 8, AP -2 and damage 2 at range. He can hit those within 12 inches, and they all have sustained hits 1, very nice for chipping away at a whole bunch of Space Marines or similar, and he could use that to hand out his Poisons ability. Then for the main event in melee, his Demonic Blades either get to choose for basically the same profile at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 and sustained 1, and he gets 12 attacks with those. Or if he wants to take out something big and scary, it's 6 attacks at strength 14, AP 3 and damage D6 +1, again with sustained hits. Whichever one he chooses, he also gets a bunch of attacks to clear lighter infantry. His Serpentine Tail strikes with 6 attacks at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 1. For his special rules, he has 2 of them. The first one is Demonic Poisons. This one might not be super impactful in every game, but is kind of fun. If he hits something at any point, then the enemy unit gets poisoned, and that lasts for the rest of the game with the chance to take a bunch of damage. Once they're poisoned, each command phase, both the Emperor Children player and the opponent's one, they'll roll a dice, and on a 4+, the unit that was poisoned takes a further D3 mortal wounds. In theory, that could mean that if he poisoned something early on, then you could basically get a complete kill by the end of the game for certain squads. Though it is a bit unreliable as to when it would trigger. A lot of the units that he hits might just die anyway, particularly in melee, and he might not necessarily want to put that lash into a suboptimal target just literally to hand out that rule. It is definitely kind of fun though. Potentially even if someone tangles with Fulgrim early on, they might still come a cropper due to the poisons that he's inflicted on them. Finally, he gets his pick 1 of 3 buff special ability, the one that all the Primarchs get, and interestingly enough, his ones are more sort of debuffs for the opponent as opposed to things to command his troops nearby. These ones you pick in the opponent's command phase, which is kind of unusual, but it feels like it makes sense. You sort of judge the situation that Fulgrim's in and how much threat he's under and for what, and choose the one that's going to cause the most disruption. First up, he has Beguiling Form, which is a -1 to hit. That one's just extra durability, and seems like a good one to go for against ranged armies in particular. Otherwise, he's got the rather terrifying Demonic Speed, which grants him fights first, and if the main threat to him is a melee one, that's probably the one to go for. It means that he can get his melee damage in and maybe kill the thing that's trying to hit him before he even takes damage at all. And for a lot of units in the game, he's just going to be completely unchargeable as a result. Finally, the last one, which is probably the most niche, is Enthralling Hypnosis. Units within 6 inches have to test a leadership test to fall back, and if they fail, they must remain in combat. I feel like it's very rare that you want to use that and not one of the others. Maybe if Fulgrim's under just absolutely no threat whatsoever. It could be really big if an enemy unit has to stay in close combat and face death from Fulgrim, but on the other hand it is just pretty unreliable. They could just pass the leadership test. Overall, he's looking like a pretty interesting, scary and very fast centerpiece. There's some interesting things that you can get from certain detachments, things like surge moves and reroll wound rolls from Champions of Slaanesh maybe. Boosted sustained hits near Daemons in the Carnival one, or lethal hits in general from the Peerless Bladesmen. He's going to be a big hard to handle threat wherever he is though, the big strengths being in movement and the fights first making him hard to deal with in melee I think. And probably the biggest weakness is that if he's just completely exposed and gets shot with a massive amount of guns, you could just lose a big chunk of your army all in one fell swoop. Even with the -1 to hit active, he's not quite as tough as some of the rest of his brothers. Otherwise though, beyond the Primarch himself, there's also Lucius the Eternal, the Emperor's Children model that's finally got an update on the old sculpt that he had. All looking rather depraved with his scars, his lash of torment, a whole ton of combat drugs, and his armour of shrieking souls, where if an enemy bests him in combat, they'll gradually turn into him. Lucius can now be fielded either as a lone operative or as the only leader for Flawless Blades, and he has a stat line that's fairly similar to them. Moving 8 inches with a toughness 5, though he gets a big 6 wounds and a good armour save with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. He also has a 5+ feel no pain as well, making him just very, very tanky for any one unit to take out. Small arms aren't going to do too much against him, and even bigger stuff will have to chip off the equivalent of 9 wounds off that profile. His printed points cost in the Codex is 140 points, which is more or less what I might have guessed. He does feel kind of equivalent to Blood Angel's Mephiston in several ways. For his weapons, he has 2 options of which to fight with in close combat. The Blade of the Layer is the one that he'd usually be striking with, I think. 6 attacks at Strength 8, AP 3, Damage 3 and Precision to take out the enemy's champions. And he gets 2 reroll hit and wound rolls versus character units, monsters and walkers. So absolutely huge personal damage there, with those big hitting attacks getting to reroll everything. And a very good chance to assassinate most normal sized characters if he jumps into a unit. Alternatively, if he needs to clear some chaff, then he's got the Lash of Torment, 10 attacks at Strength 4, AP 1 and Damage 1 with sustained hits. And then finally he also has Fights First if he's not leading a unit, so he's not a unit that you can charge lightly if he's going around as a lone operative. Overall pretty scary stuff and immense stats. 140 points though, if he does wind up being that, is a big investment. It might not feel quite as good for him using as a sort of utility role lone operative with that sort of thing. He's absolutely going to have to get a lot of value out of his damage profile at some point in the game. Definitely a model with some really cool rules though. It'd certainly be fun to use in battle. Here's just some very rough average damage output for him, to give a rough idea of what he might do. If he's not attacking a character, he go to camp for something like 3 or 4 Intercessors, or maybe 1 or 2 Terminators, but getting significantly better against his tough targets. Against say an Imperial Knight he averages 8 wounds or so. It's damage that's pretty good for a lone operative, though maybe not taking out entire squads by himself. Anything with 2 or 3 wounds and relying on an armor save mainly to keep them safe is going to be easy prey for him though. Finally, for the Emperor's Children unique datasheets, we've got their 2 unique lords. First up, the Lord Exultant, which is the more sort of generic battle commander for them. A lot of crossovers with the standard Chaos Lord. He's got 5 wounds at toughness 4 with a 4+ invulnerable save, and like a lot of the rest, he moves 7 inches. His printed points cost in the Codex is 85 points, and he can only lead the troops in the Infractors or the Tormentors. Probably the Infractors out of those 2, given that they're the melee specialists and can give him some rather nice wound rerolls. For his unit, he gives them all lethal hits via his Perfectionist special rule. That's pretty nice for allowing the Infractors in particular to be able to punch up against tougher targets with that massive amount of volume attacks, and doesn't hurt on his own mid-strength attacks either. For his weapon options, they're very much as per the model. In the one hand, he either gets the choice of a Plasma Pistol, a Power Fist with 5 attacks, or a Rapture Lash, which in this form is 4 attacks at Strength 4, AP 1, Damage 1 with extra attacks, so bonus attacks on top of his normal. In the other hand, he can either choose a Screamer Pistol, so the sort of Strength 5 damage to ignores cover profile that we saw earlier, a Mastercrafted Power Sword, which has got lower strength than the Power Fist but gains precision, or a Phoenix Spear, which looks rather cool, and it's basically kind of Power Fist-like profile but 1 less strength, but it does gain the Lance keyword. Depending on the role that you want for him, I feel like a couple of things could be at least interesting. I'd probably be most tempted by the Phoenix Spear and the Rapture Lash though. That'll give you a bunch of scary melee damage that gets better when he charges, and the extra 4 attacks at Strength 4 AP-1 definitely aren't nothing either. When he's leading his squads about, he gains either scouts or infiltrators, which means that he won't be holding back the special rules of the troops he's joining, and both of them mean that he could be getting into the mid-board and setting up charges for himself pretty easily. And finally, like the Chaos Lord and the Space Marine Captain, he gets a damage buff rule once per game. On his big go turn, he gets +3 attacks and extra AP on his weapons by 1. The attacks won't apply to the Rapture Lash, but they would apply to the Power Fist or the Power Spear. So in theory, that's a big 8 attacks there, plus another 4 Rapture Lash ones, all at really quite good AP, all having lethal hits, and maybe having some rerolls as well from the Infractors. Just for some rough damage output, this is what he could achieve on his big turn with a unit of 10 Infractors and targeting an enemy unit on a middle objective. A squad like this is absolutely a mainline damage threat, and it should blend just about any Horde unit that it goes up against, and accounts for on average around about 10 Intercessors, 4 Terminators, 16 wounds to a toughness 12 vehicle, or 12 wounds to a Land Raider, and all of this is without any detachment buffs as well. Maybe just for a really straightforward one, going for Peerless Bladesmen and getting sustained hits and using the Stratagem for extra AP should have them handling Land Raiders with ease. Otherwise though, the other Emperor's Children unique lord is the Lord Kakophonist, and he's the Noise Marine commander with the upper armoured suit and the great big Doom Siren on his back. He's actually got a surprisingly chunky profile with a movement of 6, toughness 5, I guess he is in sort of up armoured Havoc armour I suppose. gets a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable and a big 6 wounds. Interestingly, he can lead Noise Marines and Terminators, so it is possible to get a character in the squad. Though if you join the Terminators, they wouldn't be able to deep strike, as this guy can't do that. His printed points cost is 70 points, so he's a little bit cheaper than the regular Lord. I feel like that isn't too bad for his defensive stat line, and he does add his own bit of damage too. For his weapons, he can either take 1 or 2 Screamer pistols, which is really quite a lot of strength 5 and damage 2 close range fire if he wants it. That's really not too bad. Or if he wants to, he can swap out one of them for a whole bunch of melee, 6 attacks with a power sword at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1. Both of those seem reasonable enough depending on what you want to use him for. Maybe the power sword might be more tempting with Terminators, though the dual Screamer pistols if you just want to maximise range damage with Noise Marines. For his damage buff, he gets Sustained Hits 1 for ranged weapons in the model's unit. Definitely a lot more relevant for Noise Marines versus the Terminators, given that they've got a lot more serious volume fire. The Blastmasters will certainly enjoy that. And otherwise, a special rule for the Doom Siren means that if an infantry unit is hit by his unit's attacks, then you roll 3d6. For each 4+ they take a mortal wound, and if they take a mortal wound they must also take a battle shock test for good measure. That certainly doesn't hurt either, for just a little bit more damage when his squad shoots against enemy infantry, which feel like they could be good prey for the Noise Marines in the first place. Overall, certainly feels like a fun datasheet to me. Between his own firepower and his damage buff, I feel like he's justifiable enough if you just want to amp up Noise Marines to the next level. Plus could be really relevant for getting enhancements into both the Noise Marines and the Terminator squads if you want to build around them. Moving on, we get to the generic Chaos Space Marine datasheets, and first up we have the Chaos Terminators. These guys aren't so enormously different from standard Chaos Space Marine Terminators, but do have some notable differences. They get the standard Terminator stat line with 3 wounds at toughness 5 with a 4+ invulnerable save, so one of the tankier units out of the options here. A lot of other Slaanesh things tend to hit hard and be fast, but not really all that hard to take out. And they get the usual mix of special weapons. They can take 3 Power Fists and a Chain Fist for this variant within the squad of 5 of them. To maximise melee carnage, you can also add one with paired accursed weapons for the rerolls too. And the rest of the squad will be able to get either combi weapons or combi bolters, with one taking either a heavy flamer or Reaper autocannon with devastating wounds. For the differences versus regular Chaos Space Marine Terminators though, they get to move 6 inches due to being Slaanesh and a bit faster. They can only be fielded in 5s rather than 10s, so you can't create massive great big super units here. I guess the Thrill Seeker special rule will be able to deliver them into melee extra fast, and potentially they will be able to advance shoot and charge with that, which doesn't hurt a slower moving unit. And then finally their special rule is Lethal Obsession, which rather than getting dark packs for the either sustained or lethal hits and re-rolling hit rolls, instead these guys get really quite a weaker rule really. In your shooting phase, if you select to shoot and you don't split fire, you can re-roll charges against that same unit that you targeted with all your shots. It's certainly not nothing, and occasionally it might come in handy, definitely less useful than direct damage buffs though, and sometimes it might make you fire suboptimally. As mentioned, they can be led by the Lord Kakophonist, and if they do that, they won't be deep striking. I feel like at first impressions, they might struggle to have the damage outputs to compete with a bunch of the other things in the army list. The Codex points have them printed at 175 points, but it seems like they will likely be somewhere in the region of the 180 points that core Chaos Space Marine Terminators are. And I feel like at that points cost, they're probably not quite stand out tanky enough to really sell themselves compared with the big amount of dangerous things in the book. I guess we'll see though, certainly a whole bunch of different detachments, plenty of which do have some pretty nice buffs that could affect Terminators. They could do speed things in the Mercurial host, or get some lethal hits on the go with those power fists in Peerless Bladesmen. Otherwise, the Emperor's Children can field Spawn as well, and again these ones are slightly different to their equivalents in core Codex Chaos Marines. Interestingly enough, they were OC0 in Codex Chaos Marines, but they seem to have found some OC once more again here. And even just being OC1 means they can do certain actions and things, or hold uncontested objectives. If they stay at the 70 points that they're printed at, then that will buy you 2 models with 4 wounds at toughness 5 with a 4+ save and a 5+ feel no pain. They move a bit faster than regular Chaos Spawn at 10 inches, and in melee they hit with a bunch of attacks at strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2. So they can be slightly random in the number of hits that you get. Their datasheet rule is quite a good one though. The regular Chaos Spawn get to regenerate a little bit of health. Instead though, these guys get Scuttling Horrors. When enemies end a normal advance or fallback move within 9 inches of this unit, you can make a normal move of 6 inches if you're not in engagement range. That feels like a very, very nice rule to have on a sort of annoyance nuisance unit like Spawn are. Sort of small threats that the opponent doesn't want to go too far out of their way to destroy in the first place, and then if they just make themselves harder to kill, then they could continue being an annoyance for just that little bit longer. I feel like quite a nice throwaway unit to do secondary objectives, screen out, or maybe do nuisance charges. Onto the vehicle units from the generic Chaos stuff, and first up we have the Mighty Land Raider. This one's the same as it is in all sorts of variations for the Loyalists and the Chaos. A big chunky tank with toughness 12, 16 wounds and a 2+ save. Two great big Soul Shatter las cannons on either side, so 4 shots at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6 +1, some of the only long-range anti-tank that the Emperor's Children have. Though given it's paying for all its transport abilities, it's not really the most efficient damage dealer in the world, even if those las cannons will likely put a bit of hurt on an enemy vehicle or two. Its special rule is the Assault Ramp one. After a unit disembarks from it, then it's eligible to declare a charge later in the turn, and usually that means that this thing moves forward 10 inches, the unit in front gets out 3, and then your average charge threat range is 7 inches, so around about a 20-inch charge threat range, which is maybe a little bit unfortunate for the Land Raider here, given that with everything being able to advance and charge, a lot of the on-foot Emperor's Children units can have the same sort of charge threat range. As a result, I can't really see too many people paying the premium to take a Land Raider here. Provided there's some good terrain around, it might be just better to hide in the bottom of ruins and things, and then jump out on the enemy. As best I can tell, the only major change from the Chaos Space Marine version is that it gets the slightly increased transport capacity of 14. I don't know if that might be to allow you to take Lucius the Eternal alongside 6 Flawless Blades, as otherwise they wouldn't be able to fit in here. Speaking of which, it can transport Terminators and Flawless Blades. They take up 2 spaces, and they can't embark in Rhinos. I guess could be interesting for the transport themed detachment too, I suppose. Otherwise, the other transport is the Emperor's Children Rhino. That one will likely be staying at the 75 points that the vast majority of Rhinos cost in Warhammer 40k. And as ever, they're a cheap and sturdy transport, 10 wounds at toughness 9, a good movement characteristic at 12 inches, some combi shots and a Havoc launcher to chip in with some anti-infantry duties, plus 2 models can fire out the top with firing deck 2. That could be nice for a pair of Blastmasters in particular if you didn't want to disembark the Noise Marines. I feel like the Rhinos could have a bit more interest for transports, given that you can still just get out of them and then still advance and charge. They'll still add to the threat range and keep units safe up to the point where they do need to go. They feel like they'd match quite well with both the Noise Marines that want to get within that slightly closer 18-inch range, and the Infractors, which can allow the unit to scout, and then also our scary melee infantry with a character attached and can go charging out into the midboard. This Rhino does get a slightly different special rule to the auto repair that they often have, and this one's an assault vehicle. Units can disembark after the Rhino has advanced. I guess with Thrill Seekers it still might be able to shoot its firepower if there's not something else targeting the same thing, and that could be extra nice for delivering, say, Noise Marines into shooting range or line of sight if that's going to make a difference. Next up, we've got a pair of Demon Engines. First up is the Mauler Fiend. This one's printed at 140 points in the Codex, or is 130 for core Codex Chaos Marines. Mauler Fiends are sort of medium tough Demon Engines with 12 wounds at toughness 10 with a 5+ invulnerable save. They move 10 inches, and in melee they strike with a whole bunch of attacks with their fists, strength 14, AP -2 and damage d6 +1. So very nice against taking out enemy heavies or say knight equivalents. On top of that, you can either choose to double down on the melee with the Lasher Tendrils, that gives you an extra 6 attacks at strength 7, damage 1, or take Magma Cutters for a couple of melter shots at very close range. Could be a more interesting option for the Emperor's Children compared with some, given that it's a dedicated anti-tank thing in an army that doesn't have a load of choice with those. Feels like compared with core Codex Chaos Marines, it'll enjoy having it advance and charge built in whenever it needs it. And the support rule for this one isn't awful either. If it's below starting strength, you add +1 to the hit roll of the Mauler Fiend, and if it's below half strength, add +1 to the wound roll. If the opponent does some damage to it but fails to get the kill, it's going to hit harder. It can make use of a few of the Emperor's Children melee synergies as well. Next up, we've got the Helldrake, which feels like it's been left on the shelf for Games Workshop for some time in 10th edition for most armies. Though weirdly, this one got some slightly unexpected improvements. It's still a fast Demon Engine Dragonflyer thing, the hover keyword meaning it's likely going to want to start on the board, and then moving 20 inches there so it can go very far forward and still charge down the enemy. There tends to be a bit more of a disruptive style threat than an actual big damage one, only having mediocre damage against things that don't fly, but some fairly nasty melee against things that do. 5 attacks at strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2, but anti-fly and devastating wounds in that combo mean that it could be doing a lot of mortal wounds to fly units. On top of that, it either gets a Bale Flamer or the Hades autocannon, likely the Bale Flamer being the one to go for there with the auto hitting. This Emperor's Children version of the Helldrake did get a surprisingly boosted defensive stat line though. For some reason Games Workshop looked at the Helldrake and decided that it needed more toughness for some reason as the main problem with it. So it's gone up to toughness 10, a 2+ save and 14 wounds with its 5+ demon invulnerable, which I must admit is kind of surprising. It's certainly going to take a lot more chewing through for the enemy if this just boosts up to the front line, starts getting in the way and torrenting things and charging fly stuff. Weirdly, its leadership also seems to have dropped down to leadership 7+ from 6+, which does feel odd given the Mortal Fiend has a leadership 6+ still. Part of me kind of wonders whether or not someone just copy-pasted the Guard Valkyrie stat line and managed to put it on the Helldrake by mistake. Probably not, but it's kind of weird that they get exactly the same stat line now. Perhaps the leadership thing is the single weirdest thing. Otherwise, in addition to the stat line changes, the other big change that it got was Airborne Predator. For the Chaos Space Marine version, it gives you a +1 to hit against fly things. This one instead, you get a bit of damage as you move over enemies. You pick an enemy unit and you roll 2d6. For each 4+ you deal d3 mortal wounds to them and add 1 to the result if the target can fly. Not huge, but could chip in a little bit of damage here and there. Helldrakes definitely haven't been used all that much in competitive play for a long time. This definitely seems to have got better. If it stays at the same points cost, the Emperor's Children Helldrake might just be one of the better variants out there. Next up, we've got the Emperor's Children Sorcerer, a fairly similar datasheet to Core Codex Chaos Marines, which unfortunately isn't really a great thing for him. He's printed at 70 points in the Codex. The Core Codex Chaos Marine one is 60. He's a 4-wound support character with a 3+ save and no invulnerable save. He attacks with a force weapon in close combat, has strength 6, AP -2 and damage D3. The AP -2 is a little bit better than his Chaos Space Marine equivalent for some reason. And then for his ranged psychic attack, he gets one that's called Agonizing Energies, which is just basically Infernal Gaze but renamed, and the range dropped down to 18 inches. On the hazardous profile, you get d6 shots at strength 6, AP -2 and damage D3 with devastating wounds. For leading units, he can either lead the Noise Marines, Infractors or Tormentors, and for the buff for them, he gives them Warped Interference. Models in the unit get the benefit of cover, which certainly isn't nothing if they're completely out in the open, but in 10th edition 40k, cover doesn't usually tend to be the hardest thing to come by. Otherwise, his agonizing energies can also be used to slow down enemy units. After shooting, one unit hit by his psychic attack is -2 to move and -2 to charge rolls. It does have to be an infantry unit though, so it's not going to be relevant against every army and target that you're fighting. I guess he is a cheap character. You could even field him solo as a 60-point individual thing. I just can't really see him being the character of choice to either lead Noise Marines or Infractors though, given that he'd be competing against the Lord Exultant and the Lord Kakophonist. If they're somewhat similar to the same points cost, people are going to go for them rather than him, I feel. Next up, we've got the Slaanesh Demon Prince. The previous one in Core Codex Chaos Marines was 165 points. The printed cost in this book is 195, though as mentioned in this era of digital points, that might well change. This one gets a pretty similar sort of defense profile to the one in the Codex Chaos Marines. Toughness 10 with 10 wounds, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. Though interestingly, this one's gained a special rule called Lord of Excess. You get to gain Lone Operative when you're within 3 inches of some Slaanesh infantry nearby. That's really quite a cool rule. It'll have him sort of functioning a bit similar to, say, Rebute Gilliman or the Lion. Obviously not quite as threatening, but that's really going to be a big deal with keeping him safe rather than just being shot at long range. He also moves a little bit faster at 10 inches due to basically having the Mark of Slaanesh baked into him. You don't get the choice between the other marks here, though he is still going to need to go around terrain and things due to the monster keyword. For his damage output, Demon Princes still get the Infernal Cannon with 3 shots at strength 5 and damage 2. And then for the Hellforge weapons, they're fairly intimidating with 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3, or trading out to a bunch of sweep attacks with AP 0, damage 1. Though I feel like for their points costs, Demon Princes don't hit quite as hard as you might hope for really. Only 6 attacks at that profile just isn't all that much for approaching 200 points as he seems to be here. He still could be a more interesting target than many things for anything that amplifies his damage or defense though, in terms of enhancements out of the various different attachments out there. Finally, he's got 2 further special rules, a buffing rule called Excessive Vigour. Slaanesh units within 6 inches get an extra AP to their melee weapons if they make a charge this turn, and that does include him, so AP 3 on his attacks there. It is Slaanesh units as well, so it could be used on things like Demonettes, as well as the Emperor's Children infantry. I guess the AP boost could be particularly nice for the Infractors getting to AP 2. Finally, he gets a curiously named rule called Ecstatic Death. If he's slain in melee, apparently he really enjoys it. And on a 2+, he can fight before being removed if he hasn't fought already. I feel like the Lone Operative certainly makes him a bit more interesting. His damage output is a bit on the low side though, and he might struggle to coordinate that buff with units charging into melee. But still, I feel like he's got at least some interest between being a big fighty character that can take some interesting enhancements and his buffing rule. I still suspect he might be kind of on the niche side if he is all the way up at 200 points though. Otherwise, there's also the winged version of the Demon Prince as well. He moves a big 14 inches, though is only toughness 9, and otherwise is fairly similar stats to the one on foot. Again, in the Codex printed points is also listed at 195, having some trade-offs with the on-foot one. Unlike the on-foot one, he doesn't have that lone operative style rule if he's near infantry, so will be able to be directly shot. He is a bit tougher to take out than most though, with a -1 damage, so damage 2 or damage 3 weapons won't kill him quite as fast as they would otherwise. His special rule is the same as the one in Codex Chaos Marines though. When he completes a charge move, you roll 1d6 for each wound that he has remaining, and for each 4+, you deal 1 mortal wound to the target that you charged, so if he charges a target on full health, then he might average around about 5 mortal wounds, and it's capped at a maximum of 6. That's really quite a big deal, and makes him far more of a threat than just his Hellforged weapons alone. He could be an interesting enough choice to rapid ingress, as this version has deep strike as well, potentially dropping down and then being in a position to make a charge at full health. Though I guess in the Emperor's Children he might have more chance of still being able to do that by moving up the board normally too. 14 inches plus an advance and charge is pretty long even for a model that might have to either go around or over terrain. Finally, we've got the Chaos Demon datasheets, and as mentioned these are 5 of them. For keywords and things they have that Pact of Excess special rule, which just basically means that you can't take the Legions of Excess keyword that they have as your primary army. And they do lack the Emperor's Children keyword, so they're only going to have synergy with things that either key off Legions of Excess or the Slaanesh keyword, as we just saw with the Demon Prince. This version of Demonettes is really quite different to the Chaos Demons one. There's still 10 models per unit, they still move 9 inches and a toughness 3 with a 5+ invulnerable save, and get a whole flurry of attacks at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1 with devastating wounds. For the differences though, they're only OC 1 rather than OC 2. Maybe that's to represent the fact that they're summoned as opposed to more regular demons fighting as part of their main army. They've swapped their reroll rule in melee for one that causes battle shock tests. That does feel like a bit of a downgrade on the raw damage output point of view, but I feel like they've perhaps made up for that bit given that they've gained fights first, which means that certain units won't want to charge them. Even for stuff that should be able to tank their damage, there's a pretty reasonable chance that they could have a good chunk of devastating wounds happen to them before they get to activate and cut some stuff down. Overall, they feel interesting enough for a fast-moving unit that can still put some OC on objectives. They'd be able to trigger the buffs for that Demon detachment, and they do have that dedicated stratagem as well if you can spare a big 2 CP. They can return to reserve and then deep strike at 6-inch range, which they'll easily be able to make charges from with that Demon instrument that gives them +1 to charges, so a 5-inch charge. Otherwise we have Fiends of Slaanesh, not quite as brutal as they are in the Legion of Excess, as the actual mainline detachment for Chaos Demons from the Grotmas ones, given that they won't get the enormous damage rerolls here, but they're still pretty fast moving beasts at 12 inches with 4 wounds and toughness 5 and a 5+ invulnerable save, and a bunch of attacks that should be quite good against killing standard issue Space Marines, 5 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2 with dev wounds. The change to their datasheet here is for their soporific Musk special rule. Previously that was an aura of -1 to hit and -1 to desperate escape tests. Now instead it forces desperate escape tests, and anything that isn't a monster or vehicle in engagement range of them will have to test desperate escape if they want to fall back, and if they're battle shocked then they're -1 to the test as well. I guess they could get some sustained hits from the Demon detachment. Again, I'd probably suspect that they'll be more in a supporting role though if they do keep their points cost. I certainly hope that the printed codex points cost on these doesn't turn out to be accurate given it's listed at 130 points or 260 for 6 of them. I wouldn't be too surprised if the digital points turn out to be a fair bit lower than that and more in line with their Chaos Demon version. Next up we have the Demonette Cavalry in the Seekers. They can scout forward a big 9 inches and then move 14 inches after that, of move blocking the enemy into their own deployment zone right from turn 1. Really good utility there. They again strike with a whole bunch of attacks that are strength 4 and more geared towards killing light infantry than anything else. Their special rule allows them to reroll advance and charges. I feel like if you're playing the Allied Demon detachment then they'd be a pretty good choice. Fairly cheap units that can move around and trigger the buffs for Emperor's Children units and potentially have some good utility by blocking the enemy in right from turn 1 if it makes sense to. Then finally we've got the 2 Keeper of Secret variants. First off, the regular one as the Greater Demon of Slaanesh. Pretty fast moving with a 14-inch move, 18 wounds at toughness 10 with a 4+ invulnerable save, though the Shining Aegis was downgraded in quite a big way here. Previously it would just give you flatly massive more defense with a 5+ feel no pain, now it gives you a 3+ armor save instead. That's just far less good than pretty much anything that you get targeted with. Otherwise, there's no mainline changes besides just changing keywords around to target Legions of Excess things as opposed to Slaanesh Legions did in Monica. It still has some anti-infantry firepower at 18 inches and then a whole bunch of damage 2 or 3 attacks in melee. Its buffing rule is for some extra AP for Legion of Excess units nearby, and the Keeper itself is always -1 to hit. It could be one of the better units to use any of the options from that Demon detachment on. I guess you could often get sustained hits, and perhaps could be a good target for the healing as well. Finally, for the Emperor's Children, we've got the named Keeper of Secrets in Shalaxi Hellbane. They were 425 points in the Demon Index. The printed codex cost is 390, which again may change. And otherwise the profile is basically the same as Chaos Demons. A 20 wound Keeper with a different shooting attack with strength 9 and damage D3. Bigger hitting melee with Soul Piercer, which is a big strength 12 and damage D6+2 weapon. That was strength 14 in the Demons Index, though it looks like they decided to just completely rewrite Shalaxi Hellbane's rules. Previously they had big rerolls against characters, monsters and vehicles, rerolling hits, wounds and damage against them if relevant. Now though, the system to get the rerolls is to nominate a quarry at the start of the first battle round, and you'll only get your rerolls against that. It's only hits and wounds now, and not damage. It does mean that the opponent could counterplay a bit by just trying to keep that quarry out of reach, but if you can catch it and kill it, then you're going to get some big damage against it, and you'd also be able to select a new one after that. So still some pretty big potential here. The other rules also changed from -1 attack debuff to reroll advance and charge rolls. In terms of raw datasheet power, it's definitely less good, and you also get the 3+ save as opposed to the 5+ feel no pain from Shining Aegis, provided that points cost drop down enough though. Still no reason that Shalaxi couldn't be a very threatening datasheet for the points cost. Will be interesting to see the exact flavours of demons that people go for if they are building around the Chaos Demon themed detachment in this one. I feel like how strong they are is definitely going to depend on points costs. Maybe Keepers of Secrets for heavy hitting and Seekers for providing some buffs to nearby things. Demonettes could be interesting enough too with fights first. Overall, definitely some interesting stuff here for the Legions of Slaanesh. I feel like reception to the Codex so far has been broadly quite positive. I feel like the biggest negatives have been the core Codex Chaos Marine units that you're not really able to field here, and the slightly weirdly restrictive demons which are in the Codex but only relevant for one detachment. It might have been nice to have a bit more freedom with options. For positives though, the unique unit datasheets all seem interesting enough to me. I feel like most of them are going to be solidly competitive. Weirdly, it might be the Noise Marines that are the ones that perhaps look a little bit less certain, even if they can still pack a punch with a pair of Blastmasters. I'm genuinely going to be interested to see which way people go with the detachments. I think there's enough in different ones to justify different things, and just in general for the detachment buffs, a lot of them feel like they're good nice to haves, but maybe the main strength of the army being more in the datasheets as opposed to the supporting detachment rules. The Peerless Bladesmen looks really easy to use for things like Infractors or Flawless Blades, charging and killing things in melee. Mercurial Host and its movement shenanigans just seems helpful throughout. Pretty much all the rest at least have interesting stuff though. In any case though, let me know all your thoughts on the units, detachments and everything else down in the comments. Feel free to let me know anything that I might have missed or misunderstood at all. I'll post a pinned correction if I've got anything significantly wrong. I'll certainly be aiming to make a bunch more Emperor's Children videos in the near future. Hopefully a few more unit reviews, maybe an early tier list. Finally, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold. As mentioned earlier, they make their custom mag cases. If you did want a purpose-built magnetic solution for transporting models around, and they currently have a February sale off for up to 25% off a bunch of their cases. The cases are made of that sturdy MDF with a bunch of steel trays inside of it. These are the amount of miniatures that can fit on each tray, say 90 guardsmen or 30 odd terminators or 4 knight armigers, quite a lot of room on each. And then basically the cases have different sizes and heights. This one's the mini version, the sort of skirmish level case. £72 or $75 including shipping when it's in the sale, though depending on location, VAT and sales tax might apply. There's still quite a lot of room in this one, with the room to fit a Spartan and a Sakaran on the bottom floor there, plus a bunch of Terminators. The more standard size mag case is this one, £114 or $120 while on sale. This one's got a lot more room for bigger miniatures in it. You can see a tall Chaos Knight on the bottom floor there. All of these come with some magnets aimed to mount onto the bases as well, to get the models into the places where they need to be. I'll leave the dimensions for the cases on screen too. Finally, the really big one is the Mag Case XL, basically 2 of the previous attached together. This one's kind of enormous and a bit of a mighty construction. You can see a Baneblade casually chilling there along with a whole bunch of other stuff. These ones are more expensive, though they can be a little bit more or less so depending on how many steel trays you want for them. In any case, they'll be linked down in the video description below if you'd like to check them out, and a massive thank you to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave this one here for now though. Hope you've enjoyed the Big Emperor's Children review. I'll certainly be looking forward to hearing your takes down in the comments. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this, plenty more for Emperor's Children and wider things in 40k over the next few days I'm sure. And if you want to support the channel, then check out the Patreon page linked down in the video description. That's the best way to help keep these videos coming if you're finding them useful. And also there's a few other things such as seeing certain videos early from time to time, occasional votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.